So now I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Dr. Christopher Liang, the chairperson for the Department of Education and Human Services at Lehigh University and a professor of counseling psychology. And a fun fact, when we invited him, he let us know that he actually did his undergraduate work at UV and has family in Buffalo. So that was going to be exciting. His research looks at the effects of racism on the well-being of people of color, role and intersections of masculinity ideologies, and implementation and outcomes associated with building a race-centered trauma-responsive school, which is really the focus of today's talk. He has many published articles and book chapters, as well as books. So he has an edited book, The Cost of Racism for People of Color, Contextualizing Experiences of Discrimination. And he also edits one of the American Psychological Association's book series on cultural, racial, and ethnic identity. He's a fellow of the American Psychological Association in 3 different divisions, which is a pretty big deal. Former president of the Society for the Psychological Study of Men and Masculinities, and he's been recognized as a citizen psychologist by the APA through his work in schools and in the community. So we're really thrilled that he is here with us today to talk about an extremely important. So please welcome.
Is the camera still pointing in the right direction? It's up to you. One way or the other. I'm talking.
Oh, it's more towards the podium.
Perfect. There you go. That's my good side. So good. It's still good morning.
It is
good morning, everybody. I want to start by thanking Dr. Peterson, Bree, Sia, and Dr. Frederick and the Alberti Center for giving me this honor of joining you all today. It means a lot to me. I'm saying no to a lot of things these days, but because of that conversation that I had with Sia, and also because this is like a second home to me, Buffalo, I was like, sure, I'll do it. But I do want to thank you all for the invitation. I want to thank you all for joining today. I did this before too. I made the mistake. It's that cursor. Here we go. All right, I think that should do it. Nope. I want to get the thing off the screen.
Always
okay. That's the simple part too, right? We had the hard part, setting all the cameras up. I just had to push a button and I pushed the wrong one. So I as Dr. Richardson was saying earlier, I am an alumnus of the University of Buffalo, proud alumnus. I had so many great years in Buffalo, and so many stories. And I do know that one of the things that we talked about, I have a memory of this, talking about whose wings are better, Duff's or Anchor Bar, at least up there in Amherst. And I'm here to tell you that neither. So apologies to any Duff's. And I know I'm going to get booed off the stage, but apologies to Anchor Bar and Duff's fans. I'm sure you all have your favorite wing places. My favorite is Barville. Barville in, right? I am not wrong. I am people. So about Barville, if you've not had the chance, there are multiple locations now. It used to be a real pain to get wings from there, but it's so good. Worth the drive out there. I know that I'm a week early. I had the choice of coming here on April 8th, I think it was. And at that point, I wasn't looking at my calendar. I wasn't thinking anything. I was just thinking, when am I most available? So I know that I'm going to be missing the opportunity to see the South Towns. I'm here often. I'm here maybe once or twice a year. And so I know with Buffalo's luck, It's April. We might not be seeing this, and I'm gonna hope to goodness you see this, but you might see this. So anyway, that's my little love letter to Buffalo. I feel very proud of being a Buffalonian by marriage and by education. So I want to just tell you a little bit about my aims today, because I'm not here to talk about wings or weather or amazing events like the solar eclipse. We're here to talk a little bit about what it means to have a trauma responsive school that is race centered. So I want to make sure that you all know that we're not going to focus today on strategies that you can use with individuals. My orientation is around affecting the system as a whole, right? And some of you are oriented in that way, and you're going to, I think, appreciate some of the things I have to say. I want to share with you the things that we've learned in the work that we've been doing over the last 7-8 years in the Lehigh Valley. But I also want to recognize that there's a lot of knowledge in this room. There's a collective wisdom in every room, and in this room, I can see from your faces, from the scars that you're wearing, from the joy that you also are hiding, that there's a lot of wisdom in this room. So I want to capitalize on that collective wisdom and knowledge after I'm done presenting. I look forward to that opportunity to learn along with you. So my aims, provide that overview, give you a sense of what we're doing in the Lehigh Valley. Hopefully I can learn from you all as well what you're doing, and we can grow together. Now, before I start, I want to make sure that I share some acknowledgements. I come to you from Lehigh University, and that's, for those of you who don't know, that's southeast Pennsylvania, about 75 miles east of New York City, 55 miles north of Philadelphia, or some would say the middle of nowhere. But that land that we stand on, I get to work and live, is the homelands, the original homelands of Lenape people. The Lenape people were driven away from that area, and they can primarily be found now in Wisconsin, Oklahoma, and some parts of Ontario. There's still a headquarters in New Jersey, but their presence isn't really strong there. But I wanted to make sure that I acknowledge their travails and also where they are today. Wherever I go and talk, I make sure to do my best to learn as much as I can about the area that I'm at. So I'll deliver the talk, I'll prepare the talk, but also try to learn as much about the indigenous peoples of those lands. And so if you'll just indulge me for a second, even though I lived here for years, at that point in my late teens and early 20s, even though it's hard to escape the Native American names that you're confronted with it, it's really easy to escape it by not really acknowledging what it all means and the history of it. And so in preparation for today's talk, I did a little digging. And so UB and Buffalo is the original lands. For those of you all know this already, the original lands of the Seneca, comprised of many different peoples. But I wanted to share something that I learned with you in preparing for this. And some of you may know this already, but I learned about the Thomas Indian School. I had no idea about the Thomas Indian School. I'm looking at you, sister. And the Thomas Indian School is, for those of you who don't know, is not unlike the Carlisle Indian Schools. It's a place where the government took people, native peoples, and tried to take the Indian out of them, right? Real devastating, spiritually destroying. And that happened here in Buffalo. And I had no idea until I prepped this talk. There's that QR code that you see on the page there is a link to a Buffalo News story. A WGRZ did a story on this about 7 years ago. And it's worth a listen. I learned a ton. The history of it originally founded by two Presbyterians who actually taught in the native language and was, I think, by the accounts of the news, doing right by the people. But then the state government took it over and started taking away those opportunities. So stripping away the soul. And I thought I'd just share this with you. And I don't share this with you to make anyone feel bad. It really is intended to ensure that we know our history in this country. It's important to me. And at some point in the summer, when I come visit again, I hope to take a trip out and learn a little bit more in person. So I wanted to also give you a sense of who. I wanted to give you a little sense of who I am before I talk, before I give you the formal talk. So earlier, you heard a little bit about the things that I study and the things that I do and the awards that I've been given and such. Those are just things. The really more important thing is who I am. And who I am is a descendant of Chinese immigrants, immigrants from Hong Kong. My name is Liang. It's Christopher Liang, but Liang. And I have no idea where the name Christopher comes from. I don't know how my parents got that name. I never actually asked. I hope it wasn't after my uncle, but it wasn't a very kind person. Sorry if you're listening. He's not. Qinghai is a name that it means, the literal translation of Qinghai is the warm waters that you see at sunset. And that name was given to you by my father, who immigrated here in the late 60s. And that name reflects his dreams, the dreams of many immigrants, the dreams of many Americans, of hope. For him, that name reflected this idea that the sun wouldn't set on me, that the horizon would always be there for me. And so that name to me means a ton. And my relationship with my father means a ton. He immigrated here in the 60s after fighting in World War II against the communist Chinese, against the Japanese. And I have so much respect for the man. He worked 3 jobs. I have so much respect for the man. He worked 3 jobs. He and my mother worked in factories and garment factories, and we lived in poverty. And we were lucky when we got to line up for cheese and crackers. And so I bring that experience to you, again, not to make you feel proud of me or to make you feel bad for me. It is who I am, and it affects how I view the work that I do. It affects how I engage in community. It affects how I engage in research. It is something that's really important to me also because I need to make sure that when I engage in my research, when I engage in my work, that I'm checking my biases, right? Because those experiences with the divorce, with experiencing violence and witnessing violence, witnessing and experiencing, being a target of racism, those are all really powerful, and they're like deeply ingrained in my memory, right? But also deeply ingrained in my memory is a lot of laughter, and a lot of joy, and a lot of opportunity to engage in other adults, right? So I share that with you because both things are true, right? And it can happen at the same time. There is pain, there's struggle, and there's also joy and opportunity. And so as I begin this talk, right, I want you to hold on to that idea that both things are true. And if you've reflected on your own life, you know that to be true. If you're working with kids in our schools, in the Buffalo public school systems, or the reservations, like you know that both things are true, right? And you also know that a focus at the individual level is just one way to go. And for reasons I'm going to make more clear later on, incomplete. It's an incomplete way to go. So I want to acknowledge also just those moments of joy, right? People of color in this country for hundreds of years, from enslavement through attempted genocide, occupation of lands, forced removal, been targets of horrific violence, spiritual, physical, psychological, interpersonal. At the same time, throughout all of that history, there's been resistance and indeed thriving, right? Our frame causes us to look at some of those deficits, and for good reason, because we want a good meaning, good intended person wants to help elevate. But when we're only looking at the negative things, we're not allowing ourselves the opportunity to capitalize and grow the positive things, right? So I'm going to talk more about that as well. I wanted to start, I know I've already started 5 times. I want to start by talking about Martin Luther King Jr. Now, I know not all of us in this room are psychologists. I am. I'm a licensed psychologist, and it's a real big part of my identity, right? Psychology professor and all of that. But I see where psychology has failed. I see where psychology has hurt people, right? And Dr. King, in his address to the American Psychological Association during its annual convention in 1967, had a lot to say, and you can find his address online. I just want to pull a couple of quotes from his talk. And you who are in the field of psychology have given us a great word. It is the word maladjusted. This word is probably used more than any other word in psychology. He continues later by saying, I'm sure that we will recognize that there are some things in our society, some things in our world to which we should never be adjusted. There are some things concerning which we must always be maladjusted if we are to be people of goodwill. We must never adjust ourselves to racial discrimination and racial segregation. He goes on to talk about economic segregation, religious discrimination, work-related discrimination, right? So those words, pretty powerful to me. I don't know how they're landing with you. If we had more time, we'd process it. But those words are pretty meaningful to me, and they're a call to all of us in health services and education, particularly those of us in psychology with our history. So his words, spoken in 1967, are still deeply true today. Our fields in education and psychology, the gatekeepers that we are, we use these terms, these labels, under the guise of helping, and maybe guise is not the right word, but maybe with the intention of helping. But it could be more hurtful than helpful, right? So his call to me, and maybe to you, is it's a reminder to be reflective of our biases. It's a call to be moved beyond our self-interest. And it's a call to actively address the social determinants of health, the environmental side of things that cause us to stress, that cause our kids and families hurt. And so I share that with you because it's, even before I knew that address, I was thinking deeply about social determinants. I told you about my history of being targeted for racism. Beer bottles thrown at me as an adolescent in schoolyards. My cousins being choked for being Chinese, so on and so forth. Real violent history, right? And as a kid, I really wanted to understand. As I was at UB, and UB, they went from the bottles in Brooklyn to cookies. Ellicott, at Spalding, right? Cookies being thrown by white folks. Go back to China, right? Can you count the cookies at least, right? And so anyway, this stuff happened, and while I was at UB, and certainly while I was in my high school, I wanted to learn a lot more about how racism was affecting people. And so I engaged in that work for a good number of years, focusing first on Asian Americans, and then ultimately studying the psychological outcomes of racism on Latino youth and adults, as well as Black youth and adults. Studying the intersections of masculinity. How do men respond to these things? Responding with aggression or with other types of coping. So I started studying more and more about the intervening variables, right? How can we understand the link between racism and the many different negative outcomes that we were finding in education and mental health and physical health, relational health, right? And so this book here was I won't say a culmination because I'm still working on that in that area of research. But in this book, which came out in 2016, we invited authors, Dr. Alvin Alvarez and Helen Neville and I, we invited authors across different disciplines to write about how racism was affecting people in different domains of life, at different times of life, different settings. We focused a lot on the costs, right? We're actually working on the second edition now. We just started, we just got the contract. And we're pivoting, we're saying, okay, we've learned it, we know it. We have 30, 40 years of research, meta-analyses, indicating consistently the effect of racism and discrimination on people's well-being, right? We can keep studying that. We can offer another book on that. But we're focusing this next volume of the book, this next edition of the book, on how people have thrived and resisted in that time, right? Making the intentional shift away from that deficit orientation, not hiding it, not pretending like it didn't happen, but highlighting the strategies and the skills that people have used to overcome racist environments. Now, I worked in that area of research for a while, and I think I remember writing in many of the discussion sections, we need to focus on prevention. We need to go earlier in life. And so I finally decided to keep my own advice, and started working on prevention. Started working on diversity issues in schools and in community. Partnering with school districts, partnering with directors of parks and recreation out of the local city government, figuring out ways in which I could learn more about what was needed and develop things that could be helpful for those providers and for the kids that were being served in those settings. So I decided to move upstream and engage in prevention. Did that work on diversity and trauma, and I was telling Lucia the other day, like, the trauma work kind of found me, right? I was focused on racism work, on anti-racism. And at one presentation, I decided to draw people's attention to the parallels that we were finding in the research on adverse childhood experiences, along with the research that was linking racism with these negative psychological outcomes and physiological outcomes. And I didn't know this, but this was new to people, this framing. So I remember at this one presentation to schools, this principal of 20 years came up to me afterward and saying, I had no idea. You just connected all the dots. You've been working on this issue, this issue, this issue, this issue, and this issue. You just connected all the dots. This other principal came up to me after. Getting this wrong all these years. He shifted from a more punitive discipline to something more supportive and helpful. Those two principles, and I ended up doing a lot of work. They were the first two schools I worked on. But as that talk, some light bulbs go on. And people after that talk, it started inviting me to talks at the regional consortiums. And more school leaders were like, why didn't people not talk to us about trauma before? Now, that moment, I needed to make sure two things were going to happen. I needed to make sure that it wasn't going to be that it wasn't going to become just another passing fad, just like any other group implemented in schools without fidelity. And two, I need to make sure that race is extended. Right? It's real easy to gloss over racism, and you've got this thing called trauma. But I need to make sure both things happen. And as luck would have it, there are other leaders in the community that would do similar work. Are you with United Way at all? Will you partner with United? I've lived in been an academic in two cities. In both cities, I've always found myself with United Way. Or thank you, right? United Way. So with that group, United Way, we formed, was immediately about one of the founding members of that cross-sector collaborative. We focused on ways that we can leverage each other's expertise and resources so that we can improve systems. Acknowledging that some of us are going to be working on a responsive crisis counseling, but others of us to work together on building communities that were resilient. And so my task as part of this collaborative was to focus on delivering in-service training, professional development, educators. And in that work, I'll tell you what we did. We provided a lot of information on the basics of trauma, the brain. Also, as I said earlier, I'm going to move away from race. We also focused on the attributions of how we understand behavior. Right? We talked about, because we care deeply about teachers, we talked about how occupational stress and secondary trauma and implicit biases intersect. A little bit more about that. And so we wanted to make sure that we centered race, that we made sure that people didn't feel like they were being shamed or blamed, that they understood that it's the normal human process, that to make sense of the world, we take shortcuts. And we want to normalize that for people. We always wanted to make sure, though, that we stayed focused on the teachers themselves. So in that work, we talked about ACEs. All of you probably know ACEs. You may be tired of hearing about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, originally developed by Liang and Toletti, and they're now sort of seminal paper. But that work has been expanded by a group of researchers in the Philly area, not home at all, talked about how there are different types of adverse childhood experiences that we also need to consider. So the original ACEs, right, as described by Liang and Toletti, are household family type of adverse childhood experiences. A lot of folks experience them. That's across different economic groups, and it cuts across all racial groups. What more recent research has found is that kids of color, kids from the global majority, experience these types of trauma at a higher rate, particularly those living in poverty. Right? And those individuals are also experiencing other forms of community level trauma that might not be exposed to. Things like racism, things like community violence, being part of the foster system. bullying. And we know that bullying cuts across different groups of people. There are certain folks who are even more vulnerable. Sexual minorities, gender minorities. Right? Those individuals are at greater risk. So we need to pay attention to the different types of adverse childhood experiences that kids might be encountering. Now, our task, and it was very intentional, wasn't to convince people that these things existed. It wasn't to convince people that racism existed. It's just to show them the data. Here are the data. You can do with these data what you want. But these are what the data are saying. Kids of color are experiencing high rates of trauma and are also experiencing racism. Here's 30 years of research showing the linkages. Do with it what you want. Figure out Israel. How you think? Do with it what you want. I hope I didn't extend any or flatterers there. So we wanted to focus on racism. And so we didn't shy away from it, but we did talk about it with some compassion and with an eye towards building empathy. So we would show slides like this and discuss in our professional development. In this slide, those of you who can't read it from this call, this is from Dr. David Sirlow. That is what must it be from the knowing the world hates you. Now, I don't share this to make people feel uncomfortable. And that's not my aim. My aim isn't to re-traumatize Black folks in the room. My aim isn't to make white folks or non-folks feel uncomfortable. Right? This is a reality that folks experience. Not knowing what spaces they can go into, and not knowing where they can feel safe. Because people see them as a threat, right? So we share this to build empathy and to start bringing in what's happening in the community into the room to help teachers understand that the things that they're experiencing, right, with their Black students, with their Brown students, might not have anything to do with them, but it definitely has something to do with what's going on in our. Again, not to put people on. It's just, this is what's going on. I'm not blaming you. This is what's happening. Can we pause for a moment to embrace that possibility? And so what we're trying to do in our work is we're trying to address the invisibility of whiteness. We're trying to decenter it, this logic, trying to unpack what it means to be operating from a white cultural logic where white people's classrooms are centered and valued, and every other way of being has the potential of being labeled as a deficit or as a problem to be corrected and remedied. This is a quote from Daryl Sue. Scholars like Subini Anama, special education educator, also writes about this in her Theorizing Script, where she combines critical race theory with disability studies to highlight why and how kids of color may be disproportionately labeled with an EBD. And so we do this work. And one of the ways that we do this is by letting those attributions that people hold very, very easily without knowing. So, pause from the talk and we can give them a quick activity. So, to illustrate what we do. So, how many of you would say that you're a good driver? Sorry. Buffalo is known for safe driving, so very excited. Go Western New York. Okay. So, how many of you raise your hand? Can you click all of? Okay. How many of you have said that someone else should get off the road in their background. Okay, good. What caused you that caused you to say they need to get off the road, they should not be driving?
Small meetings.
Road too slow. Tailgate. Yeah, roll stop signs. So, how many of you have ever switched lanes without using your direction? Okay, how many of you have ever rolled past the stop sign? You're raising your hand. I think that's all there. You have driven those friends. So what just happened there? People. So, sure happened what you say. So what happened there was, for ourselves, we're not judging ourselves as bad drivers as well. We just need to get to where we need to get. And that person was in my way. That stop sign in the red. I swear I wasn't there yesterday. Right? We're making a lot of that. We're making probably a lot of context for why we engage the behavior. But those other drivers, they can't get off. Right? We're saying you're a bad driver. We're making an attribution, dispositional attribution, as opposed to situational attribution. I think we do this for groups of people. Women are bad drivers. Asian American women are bad drivers. Old people are bad drivers. Y'all did if you're an old Asian American woman. Right? Like, you're never going anywhere. So this is how we end up extending these attributions to entire groups of people. We use that example because that's very personal. We all have experiences with it. And it's not that. But in education spaces, it happens also. That kid is lazy. Those kids are lazy. That community they don't care about education. So the attributions that we're making are central to how we end up engaging in those kids. We're likely to make those attributions when we're stressed, which we know teachers are experiencing right now. Which is why teacher well-being is so important. Because when they're stressed and they're making those attributions, they're more likely to punish those kids, ignore bullying, all sorts of stuff that are not helpful to kids. So we need to address those issues because we just need to help the teachers see that these kids were experiencing things in their families and in their communities they might not be thinking about. We needed to have those teachers start asking the question of what's going on, as opposed to just what's wrong with that kid. So we wanted to make it personal and shift it to their work. And we found some really nice things in our work in professional development. We sampled about 552 educators in the first study that we presented in this paper. And in that work, we saw that there were attitude changes. Right? Now, it's a real basic study. I wish we could have followed it up more longitudinally and some more distal types of outcomes, recognizing that attitude change in post doesn't really signify a whole lot. In the second study, we studied 4 schools where they